this episode of the PrimateCast, primate evolution scientist Dr. Tesla Monson.
Evolution,
communication,
cognition,
conservation,
behavior,
primatology,
typically primates.
Become the monkey.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh of Kyoto University's Wildlife Research Center, and the podcast is brought to you by the Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology at Kyoto University's Center for the Evolutionary Origins of Human Behavior. In this episode, I'm really excited to showcase a conversation that I had with Dr. Tesla Monson, assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Western Washington University. Tesla was in Japan visiting our own Dr. Susumu Tomiya to start some work with our collection of primate bones. Tesla gave us a couple of talks during the week she was here, one about her research and the other about her efforts in science communication. So I made sure we touched on both of those topics in the interview here. To round things out, and because it's always fun to have more friends in the studio, Susumu himself joined us for the conversation. Tesla runs the Primate Evolution Lab at Western Washington University, and as we get to it in the interview, she's conducted some fascinating research into how we can use bones, fossils, and especially teeth to understand the quote-unquote squishy parts of our collective evolutionary past, the ones that don't really preserve, like the life history traits of an animal or its behavior. In a sort of detective story for the ages, Tesla describes how she and her colleagues, led by Dr. Leslie Halusko at the University of California, Berkeley, discovered that certain characteristics of teeth from ancient peoples in Arctic Beringia might be the key to understanding a seemingly unrelated adaptation that increases nutrient delivery, vitamin D, to infants in a harsh northern environment. Tesla also describes her discovery that dental patterns in catarrhine primates are correlated with prenatal growth rates, which is the speed at which a fetus develops in utero before birth. So by measuring teeth, we can learn something about what pregnancies might have looked like in extinct species, and what kinds of energy demands might then have been faced by the females of those species during reproduction. Discoveries like these of correlated or pattern evolution that link tooth characteristics with other anatomical and physiological processes mean that scientists can hypothesize about different processes that aren't even preserved in the fossil record by observing what remains to be found. And what remains to be found a lot of the time are teeth. So I admit, after hearing Tesla talk about these things, I became a lot more interested in teeth myself. But there's a lot in this interview beyond teeth for anyone interested in things like evolution and the diversity of life, how scientists are often just like detectives, and just generally about being a whole person, even outside of the academy. While discussing Tesla's efforts in science communication, for example, we briefly touch on and actually return later to the phenomenon of imposter syndrome, which can affect anyone in any role but seems to be particularly common among academics, and especially in early career researchers. All three of us seem to have something to say on the topic, as it's an ongoing struggle for so many of us, and any encouragement and open discussion about it that we can have might land with someone, in need just at the right time. We close by looking at our current projects on inclusion in and out of science, such as our symposia in integrative human evolution, geared toward early career researchers and interdisciplinarity, her involvement with the Bearded Ladies group, who are out there to show the world that, to quote Tesla, you don't have to have a beard to be a scruffy paleontologist out in the field, and lastly, her efforts to highlight the key roles played by historical women in Washington, an effort she calls Washington Women. So it was just such a pleasure to have had this conversation, this chance to chat with Tesla and to share it with Susumu in the studio, and now here in the form of this podcast interview with the rest of you. Please enjoy it as much as we did. Tesla, you were invited here by Susumu, who's also here in the studio with us, to do two things. Well, I mean, you also have your own thing to do in the collections, and we'll get to that later. But the way I want to set up this interview is that we actually gave you a lot of work to do when you came here. So I know that for a typical academic, you're used to being invited to give talks and things about your research, and you'll do that. And we also did that. Susumu was certainly on his game getting you to give a research talk, but we also asked you to do a SciComm talk. And it seems like that's throwing a whole nother ball game at you to put together two completely different things. But it seemed from the process that you're actually really conversant in both. And yeah, I just wanted, maybe we can get started by asking you, how have you had this kind of invite before where you've been asked to give a research and a SciComm talk separately? Is that something that you've experienced, and how was that process getting ready for it?
So I have definitely never been asked to give 2 talks in one visit. So this is the first time, but I really enjoyed it. I've given SciComm talks before for specific events, and I've given research talks, but again, never done 2 in 1 week. But I really enjoyed it because it really had me think about my work in 2 completely different ways, which is nice, and really to express things that I care about that are different but overlap in a lot of ways. So I didn't mind at all giving the 2 talks, and I thought the SciComm talk was a lot of fun actually to give. I had a lot of fun with it. So I really enjoyed it, and I'm probably going to recycle it in the future. So, that's the great thing about giving a talk, is that you're just laying the groundwork for future talks that you give as well.
One thing that I thought was really fun that you did, because I attended both talks. So in the first one, you gave the research background and updates, and you started it with a little background of yourself and your education, where you were at the different stages of your early career. And then you recycled that same structure in the SciComm talk. But what was cool is you added, rather than talking about all the research you did at these places, you talked about all the kind of SciComm and extracurriculars that you were doing as well. And so it seemed to me right from the very beginning that this was something really of interest to you, was to make sure that wherever you were also having this kind of outside of the lab or outside of the classroom engagement and outreach with different kinds of communities. So was that intentional right from the beginning?
If by from the beginning you mean when I wrote the SciComm talk earlier this week, then yes, it was. But, as I already had a research talk, mostly put together, and I added things to it. But as I was thinking about the SciComm talk, I really wanted to consider the things that I wanted to get across. And right from the beginning, I wanted to emphasize that scientists are not, cookie cutter. We're not cut out of a mold. We're all people, and we're multifaceted. And so I thought that was a really good way to really emphasize that is as you said, use the same structure, but then say, but look, I'm a person and I did all these other things. And in the end, those things actually helped advance my career and helped me get where I am and helped me do the things I love. And so you don't need to shy away from being a complete person or talking about who you are. And it's something I do with my students too in the classroom, because, students, they just have this idea of what a scientist is and what science is, and it doesn't sound that exciting. So I can put lots of pictures of fossils and going to cool places, but it's more than that, because, we're people and we do a lot of things, and they don't have to be exclusionary by any means.
Mm-hmm. And so similar too, I realized when you joined us here a few years ago, I don't know how appropriate it is to get into it, but I want to talk a little bit about the hiring process, because when we put out this call to work for an assistant professor to work in our international center, the call itself was a little bit strange, because we wanted somebody with a bit of a SciComm background, someone who had ideas for engagement that involved students, and to help us teach this graduate seminar in science communication that we've had for a number of years. And there was a funny tweet storm, I don't know, a little meme that was going around recently about unreasonable job calls in anthropology. Tesla, did you see that?
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, and so they were making the comment that it's unreasonable to expect early career scientists to be able to spend so much time on these applications and all of the ridiculous things they were being asked to put together. And it made me think, for our SciCast one, we actually asked people to have a statement about science communication in their application, but also the job talk that we asked our shortlisted applicants to give was actually not only about their research, but how they would use their research and integrate that into an outreach program, or to get student engagement, to teach SciComm through their own kind of experiences. And so, Susumu, I want to ask you, we had an interview with you recently on the PrimateCast, and we talked a bit about SciComm, not about this specifically. So I'm wondering, when you first came here, or when you were getting ready to come here, what that was like for you. We've asked Tesla to come and give a couple of talks. We kind of put you through the ringer as well.
Yeah, well, science communication and helping students become better at science communication has been a major part of my job since I arrived at this institute. So in that sense, I think what I went through during that hiring process was entirely fair and very relevant. It's been really interesting learning how to teach science communication to a group of really diverse students who come from all over the world, and most of them are not native speakers of English, so there's that language component to it also. And also people have different cultural expectations about what scientists should be doing and should not be doing and so on. So it's been a really stimulating experience for me being involved in that department, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Tesla, it seems like from the SciComm talk that you gave and the outreach talk that you gave, and just from pattering around on your website a little bit, that not only for yourself, but you've also tried to increase the number of opportunities for the people around you. For example, other graduate students, when you were a graduate student at UC Berkeley, through your radio program and podcast, The Graduates, but giving others an opportunity to showcase what they do and get involved in science communication as well. And so kind of tying that into my earlier question about, is this always been something that's important for you? Where did that come from in your work? And is it something that you also were given opportunities earlier on in your career to engage with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do think that, fingers crossed, science is changing, right? That this younger generation is changing, and that science communication and caring about students in a new and more interactive way is just sort of becoming the norm. I think that younger, early career scientists recognize that it's not just about publishing and publish or perish, right? That is hopefully going to be a thing of the past. And so in terms of, I don't know if I was given these opportunities, but I do think that having a supportive community of graduate students was always really essential for getting me through grad school. The community, I couldn't have done it without other students. And I just feel like we need to build each other up. As being a woman in science, being from an underrepresented group, whatever you want to say, but why not help other people? Maybe it comes from being at an R1. There was, at an R1 for your PhD, there's a lot of animosity you see it between faculty. You see the competitive drive. You see people not always being friendly. And I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to, it doesn't hurt, it doesn't take anything away from me to help other people climb the ladder. It's like every step I take, I want to pull people up with me. That only makes, it just makes everything better. And the more people we have doing good things and helping people, I mean, that's how you spread science, and that's how you spread like a helpful community that is, not this hostile R1 environment that sometimes you hear about or you hear described. I don't know. I just think that we're all in it together, and there's no reason not to help other people. I don't know. And as I said in the talk, that's why I also framed it as it helps you too, because some people do want to ask like, well, what will this do for me in my CV? And it's like, it's going to help you. It's going to help your skills. It's going to help your CV, but it's also going to help other people. And that is very rewarding in and of itself, I think. And yeah, and the more I teach and the more I work with undergrads and master's students, I was just telling Tasumi this, I used to write grants to like fund my own work and to collect data. And now I just write grants to fund my students and to help them gain new skills and new opportunities. And, I'm going to try and write a grant to bring one of the Japanese grad students over to my side of the world and send some of my students here, because if they get to have fun doing science, like that can change their life forever, and it can change the future of science. And if we want to make an impact, it's more than just 10 people reading a paper about, a monkey fossil. It's about really the waves that you can send out by changing someone's life forever. I mean, it just has a lot more impact to me now.
Yeah. So I I think we'll circle back to this science communication. I know you have a number of initiatives that listeners are really going to want to hear about. But since you were just mentioning grad school, PhDs at an R1 university, the two of you were concurrent at UC Berkeley,
We
correct?
overlapped a little bit.
We overlapped a little bit.
Yeah. So Tesla came in as a new graduate student right when I was about to leave. But we overlapped by a little less than a year or something like that.
When did you finish?
2012. But then I taught as a lecturer for another year or so.
Yeah, I started in 2012.
Yeah. I do remember Tesla as a very motivated, serious, and unusually polite graduate student.
Unusually polite.
I don't know. I think your memory, but I also
then
remember
I knew she would succeed in this
you were
business.
also very polite, and we overlapped in the Museum of Paleontology. And, so we did overlap. Yep.
Well, I want to push a little bit here because that's, for a podcast, a little boring to say each other we're very polite. You don't have any dirt. You don't have any dirt to share on each other.
Yeah, the good thing is we didn't overlap long enough for Tesla to know embarrassing stories about me.
Unfortunate.
Hopefully not.
No, I don't know any. I'm surprised you don't know a few about me, but no, I felt like when I came in, coming from an anthropology background, I definitely came in with very hardcore imposter syndrome, right? Everyone has it at different stages, but I just didn't have the same biology training as a lot of the other students. And so I felt really out of my element, and I'd gotten in on a fluke, in that I just couldn't let anyone see that I didn't know what I was doing, like all these things. And so in the beginning, I was definitely, wearing a lot of ratty hooded sweatshirts and having dyed hair and kind of just being a nuisance. But that hasn't changed too much, but I do know a lot more about biology now.
Yeah. Just to hang on that for a second, I know that the imposter syndrome is something that, as academics, it's so prevalent, especially in early career. I think probably in middle and late career academics as well, although it might be less evident, but I think it's worth holding on that for a minute and just exploring a bit more. So if you think about that, your own experiences going into UC Berkeley, and obviously there's it's a very well-known institution, and I'm sure you were working with experts, and you would have had that feeling coming in, as you mentioned already, as kind of being underprepared or not worthy of that. So what, as someone who's coming up on tenure now and has been an assistant professor at Western Washington University for some time, how do you feel that process has gone for you, and where is it now?
As you said, I don't know if it ever goes away, but that doesn't mean you can't reconcile with it. I don't know, fake it till you make it. I think this is another reason I put all those images in my SciComm talk of me on stage in different ways, because I do think that I've built confidence in other aspects of my life, and that translates into my science. And I don't know, one of the things you learn in grad school is that you don't know anything. So feeling more comfortable not knowing things was a big part of grad school, and being able to embrace that and realizing that you have a lifetime to learn. So you can just keep learning. And I don't know, I definitely haven't gotten over imposter syndrome, but I like who I am, and I feel comfortable with who I am. And so I think that goes a long way in science. And I don't have any good answers for that one. What about you?
I don't know, but I do think there's a lot that advisors can do to help reduce the anxiety and the imposter syndrome that graduate students are feeling. And now you are in a position to advise graduate students at Western Washington University, right? So are there things that you try to do or try not to do in your capacity?
Yeah, so I definitely try and let them know that I used to be in the same exact position as them. I sometimes use this analogy of juggling, that look, when I started out and you're in the same spot, it was all about juggling like one or two balls at a time. And as you go, you figure out how to add more. And now I've got like 20 balls in the air that I'm juggling. But it's a learning process, and you can get there. So you don't need to feel like just overnight you can do all of these things, or you see people at higher career stage or further along, and it seems like they're just doing so much. And how do they do it? It's like practice. You just practice a lot. You practice writing, and then all of a sudden, instead of taking 6 months to write a grant, it takes like 2 weeks because you've just practiced. And so just trying to reassure them that it's a process and that you don't need to get there overnight, and that, you're doing a great job. And just always tell them they're doing a great job. And
I feel like there's never too much encouragement from the prospective graduate students. So I always try to,
That's one of Susumu's superpowers, right? Is being encouraging and positive. Yes. And, I think what you mentioned there about being confident in yourself or comfortable with yourself outside of the workplace is super important, because I think we, especially as academics, when we think that our intellectual ability is the major contribution that we can have in this world, that in itself creates this really unnecessary and unfair situation for all of us, where we put so much value in what we contribute in that sense. And it's easy to kind of, especially as a grad student, when you're, put almost everything into what you're doing in your study in order to be successful. But even later on in your academic career too, it can easily do that. So having that balance of, where you see value in yourself seems to be really, really important. And the other thing I wanted to say is, you mentioned practice, and then you just keep adding things, and eventually you can get by, but you don't always feel like you're getting by as well as you want to be, right? So even though you're adding those things and you look from the outside capable of doing them, it doesn't mean that you yourself feel that you've perfected the art. And that can be problematic too. But I think maybe just letting people know that it's okay not to feel like everything you're doing is amazing, right? But the fact is, you just do it.
Yeah, you just do it. And I do think it's very important to measure only against yourself. It's like, you're always going to see people winning the Nobel Prize or getting these major grants. Like, you are not them. You don't need to be them. No one's asking you to be them. So I set goals for myself, and then I try and accomplish them. And, every time I set a personal best, I feel good. I feel good about it. And so I just try and focus on that, as opposed to thinking about what's going on. Yeah, there's always going to be someone doing something flashier and bigger and more publicity and all those things. But I don't know. I just want to be happy and do what I love, which is science and teaching and working with students. And
right,
I'm very happy right now.
Yeah, I think for me, a sense of purpose has been really important, and that has kept me in this business, because you get so many rejections in academia, right? Grant applications get rejected, job applications get rejected. So you need to get used to that and learn not to take them personally. And then, but if you always have a strong sense of why you are doing science, that can keep you going for a long time. So
yeah, and I think that also verges into the work-life balance, because you do get a lot of rejections, and it can be really difficult, but just being able to step away and do other things that you love is so important. Just not to have everything hanging on your next application, for example. So I feel really lucky. I think a lot of early career researchers are realizing that being at a teaching-focused university has a lot of advantages. And for me, certainly the advantage is not feeling so much pressure about getting these grant applications or getting these big papers. I do it because I want to and I love it, but I'm not feeling pressured by my institution. I have to teach a lot, but I can be creative and come up with new fun ways to do it. And so for me, that really helps my work-life balance, because if I need to step back from work, from research, I can step back, take the time I need. And if I want to go, head first into a new project really quickly and really fast and kind of exhaust myself, I can do that too. And so I feel a lot of freedom at my institution, and I'm really grateful for the support that I have from my department. So it's been wonderful.
Okay, that's cool. I'm glad you mentioned teaching. I want to circle back to that a bit later on among various other things that keep popping up. But why don't we get to what it is that's driving you about research and science these days. So it seems like you have this, you're incredibly enthusiastic about science and about what you do specifically. And we got to see that on display during your research talk here this week in Inuyama. And so this might be a little bit of a 180, but Susumu was recently part of a team that published a new paper introducing a new fossil saber-toothed carnivore.
Yeah. With a colleague of ours, right?
Ash
With
Paus
Ash Paus, yeah.
at San Diego Natural History Museum.
We also overlapped at Berkeley. It's a little bit of a Berkeley.
We are friends.
Yes.
Yeah, we're all friends.
Great. So there's a lot of teeth in that, or a lot of tooth in that animal. And I know that you have an inordinate enthusiasm for teeth as well. So maybe to get us started into your science, why don't you talk about teeth and what we can learn from them?
Of course. Yeah, I love teeth. No, I think they're fascinating for so many reasons. I think that the easiest reason to say teeth are very cool is because I'm interested in the past, which means I'm interested in the fossil record, and teeth are, more than 95% inorganic material, so they fossilize very well. They dominate vertebrate fossil assemblages, so you find a lot of them, and that alone means that knowing a little bit about teeth is really going to help you understand the past. So that's a great thing about teeth. But they just have so many wonderful traits in terms of biology and evolutionary history. They only evolved once in vertebrates, so they have this shared developmental evolutionary history, which means they share a lot of the genes. So you can look at teeth in other animals and learn a lot about humans. For example, they capture information about diet, social structure, like how animals fight each other, right? All these different things you can learn from teeth. So they're just a wealth of information. They're everywhere in the fossil record. They look super cool. If you've never seen a red panda tooth, check that out, because those are very cool teeth. I mean, lots of animals have super cool teeth. The muntjac deer, the little vampire deer, like just super cool things going on. And so I do love teeth. I think they're really fun for a lot of reasons. I don't know. I've always been really into patterns. I'm someone who likes puzzles and patterns. And that's really how I got interested in teeth in the first place, was taking an osteology class, looking at those molars in primates and humans, and really thinking about iterative structures in the skeletal system. So things that look pretty much the same, like the molars, but a little bit different, and just trying to, just a really cool puzzle to think about. How did that evolve? How did they develop? And how do we get all of this amazing variation that we see in mammals today?
Yeah. So in thinking about that, I'll preface it by saying, first of all, I'm a total noob when it comes to teeth, but I did, as an undergrad at the University of Calgary, work in a primate evolution lab, and did a study on Antillean primate teeth from the Caribbean, which partly we had in the collection, but also in the literature. And then just this past year, I was actually a co-author on a study about Koshima macaque teeth, looking at, and this is not fossil teeth, but relatively recent past, looking at patterns of wear. I was not involved in the analysis at all, but what it just reiterated for me is, like, when you're looking at, obviously, if I look at my own mouth, and we have a lot of experience with the dentist, so you can see variation. But I think you mentioned during your talk that one of the great things about teeth is they preserve really well as well. But if you're thinking about teeth in collections, and you might have a lot of them, and pattern evolution, I mean, how easy is it for you when you see like a collection of teeth to just kind of pick things out at will?
Pick them out in what sense?
Well, I just mean, so to distinguish. So I asked you, we had lunch the other day together. I said, in paleontology, it feels like, especially when you work with collections, or if you're out there in the field digging, the expertise required to detect something once you've come across the material, wherever that may be, seems like it's next level. And certainly there's going to be variation in people's skills and specializations to be able to do that. But I feel like if you have a whole, collection of teeth in front of you, that would be one of the things where, sure, a canine is very different from molar. But But when you're looking at the different molars, for example, there's some variation, a lot of similarities. So when you approach that, like, just kind of a naive question is, what is the process like when you have a collection suddenly of all these teeth? How do you go about deciphering what's going on there?
Well, it's a lot easier if they're still in the jaws, I will say. Identifying individual teeth is definitely a talent, and sometimes it can't actually be done. So I prefer when they're still in the mouth.
I see.
Because then you know exactly which teeth you're looking at, and you can fairly easily tell whether or not they're the adult teeth or the deciduous teeth, which is the first generation of teeth in mammals. So in that situation, it's not that difficult once you've had a little bit of training. I will say in the collections here, I did see a couple animals that had extra teeth. So like an M4, even an M5.
Oh, wow.
Very exciting. So for me, that's the kind of thing that's like, ooh, what's going on, right? How'd that happen? And they looked totally bizarre. So very interesting to think about. Took some pictures for sure.
Yeah.
When they're in the mouth, it's not that hard.
So one of the things you mentioned, since teeth are so well preserved, presumably that's a very rich source of information about the past. But I imagine that if you're out there digging, teeth in mandibles seems like the best case scenario. But I imagine you also find a lot of individual, and maybe more so than the ones attached to jaws. So that was maybe what I was kind of getting at.
Yeah. So if they're individual teeth, and so I don't work as much on that, but usually you can distinguish the class of teeth. So as you mentioned, a canine is going to look very different from a molar. And if you can tell fairly easily from the shape of the tooth which type of animal it belongs to. So especially if you're talking about things like an herbivore versus a carnivore, there's really distinctive differences because the way that those animals chew and process food. And then you can also look for patterns in terms of where they would rub up against other teeth in the jaw. So your M2 is going to be rubbing up against the M1 and the M3. So you might see some specific kinds of wear, interstitial wear associated with that. So there's all these ways, all these little clues. So it is a puzzle, right? Little clues to help you identify exactly which tooth you're looking at. And sometimes the third molar looks very different from the first molar. And so, I mean, I always tell my students in osteology, even the best osteologists take reference texts with them. You know, you don't have to know everything forever, right? You can consult a book. That's totally fine. So I'm not embarrassed to say that I will definitely use reference images to help me feel certain about a diagnosis. Maybe Susumu just knows it all.
No. But we also take a lot of measurements of teeth, either to identify the teeth or to look at the patterns of relative tooth size variation like Tesla does. So there's a lot of quantitative data you can gather from teeth. And of course, there are things like isotopic analysis of enamel, which can be helpful for reconstructing the diet of the animal. There are a lot of things people can do with even isolated fossilized teeth.
Right.
And this is why the collections like you have here in Inuyama are so important, because those measurements don't mean anything if you don't have something to compare it to. So it's very important to have these collections, both of extant and fossil animals, so that we can build these large data sets and databases of dental variation. So then when we find something, we can take that measurement and compare it to our database and feel confident that we know where it fits in with the variation that we see in closely related animals.
So, I mean, I think it's obvious to think about the kind of physical characteristics, and if you're trying to put things in an anatomical sense, how different organisms fit together from the fossil record, that makes a lot of sense. But maybe we can transition into some things that you've been talking about in your work here in Inuyama and recent published studies, where you're not specifically interested in the shape of the teeth themselves for themselves, but more of what they can tell you about other traits. And in your talk, you talked about the squishy stuff we can't measure in the fossil record because they don't preserve. But I was quite surprised to see how so for example, the different proportions that teeth have in a jaw could relate to things like the prenatal growth rates, or even before that, how patterns of dentition relate to delivery of vitamin D in breast milk. So can you maybe walk us through a little bit about how you can use teeth to understand those very non-teeth related things?
Yes, absolutely. And so you mentioned two very cool studies that I've been a part of over the last couple of years. So teeth they start developing very early in utero. So we know a lot about teeth. We've been studying them for a very, very long time. We know a lot about them, but not everything. And so there's a lot to be learned about how they develop and exactly which genes are influencing that development. But they start developing very early in utero, and nothing is independent in the body. Okay? We are a complex system. And so we can try and study these individual isolated things, but it's important to remember that nothing really develops in isolation, and that includes teeth. So as the fetus is developing in utero, the genes that are coding for that tooth development and the environmental interactions and all the development that's going on is also being influenced by other things that are developing, including the rest of the skeleton. So I'm thinking about the skeleton, but the skeleton is, it's the structure for our body, and it changes through our lifespan, and it's associated with all these things like puberty, right? Like reproduction, things that I'm interested in. So it's just a very complex web. And what we've been able to show is that teeth carry signals of those other things that are developing. And it's because a lot of genes are not, most genes are not just coding one thing. So when you see it in the news, it's always a gene codes this or a gene does that. Well, it's kind of like the alphabet, a very complex alphabet. We have these individual genes, but they form these very complex iterative structures like words that then can become this very complex language. So when genes are acting, they're not just affecting one thing, they're affecting many things. And so we use what we call a phenotype back approach, meaning that we're looking at variation in phenotypes, the outward structure or the outward end all be all of these genes in development. But we're using that to try and track back what else might be associated. So a gene can affect many different things, including tooth development. So if you see variation in a tooth, it could also indicate variation in another structure. And that's like the complex web that we're trying to detangle. So in the study you mentioned about breast milk, that was led by Dr. Leslie Olesko. And from that, we were looking at dental shoveling, which is a trait in the incisors of teeth. It's been recognized for a long time. It varies across different human populations. There's been a lot of hypotheses about why some populations might have a lot more dental shoveling than others. We never see it 100% in one population and 0 in another, but we do see some populations have it quite often and others do not. And there's always been this idea that it must be advantageous, right? There's something about the teeth themselves, and maybe it helps create more biomechanical support during chewing, or all these hypotheses. But with advances in genetics research and understanding which genes affect teeth, we were able to go to the literature and look at this gene EDAR, which does a lot of things. It affects hair thickness, it affects sweat gland density, it affects dental shape, including dental shoveling, and it affects mammary gland density. So it has all these different effects, this one gene. And through our work, what we showed is that the frequency of dental shoveling is significantly associated with the frequency of this gene. And that from that, we were able to demonstrate strong selection in a population that was in Beringia, 10 to 20,000 years ago. It's an area of very low UV, which can be detrimental because you need UV to help produce vitamin D, which is important for development. And so long story short, what we showed is that this this population was under selection for EDAR, and it was likely related to mammary gland density and the ability to pass more vitamin D through the breast milk. And so the teeth just came along for the ride. They looked different in that population, not for any inherent reason of the teeth themselves, but for something else that was happening in the body. So teeth, again, can be used like this very cool map to see what else is going on. And so my recent work's been looking at other reproductive traits, as you mentioned, prenatal growth, so how quickly you grow in utero.
Can we, before we get to that,
Yes, yeah,
I just wanted to stop you on so you mentioned a few different traits related to that EDAR gene. And I think this is a kind of thing that makes painting a story about adaptations quite complicated. So maybe you recognize in this study that the vitamin D is maybe the key component, that obviously as humans would have been moving into more higher latitude areas, there's less UV radiation, so less sunlight. So we need some other kind of ways to manufacture the required vitamins in our bodies. But then there are other things that are complicated by that as well. So in the specific case of the teeth, I think that was dental shoveling you mentioned. Are there any possible, I first of all, I just imagine people looking at these teeth and thinking, oh, what could be the adaptation? And then obviously it has nothing to do with that. It's just like a byproduct of this other process. But are there any examples that you know of where there's competition then? So because this must force a trade-off at some point. Relative to that study, were there any potential trade-offs that you would think about?
So a trade-off for having more dense mammary glands, or for having the bigger teeth, or what?
Yeah, so I mean, if you have like a selection for higher density mammary glands in order to deliver breast milk that would provide more vitamin D to an infant, could that potentially have any? And then the teeth that are kind of on the ride, along for the ride, is there any potential negative or kind of pushback selection on the teeth side, for example? Or you mentioned some other things that are connected to EDAR gene as well.
Yeah, so we haven't come up with any potential pushback. I mean, there's always the potential there. I know that Dr. Lusko is actually looking at EDAR and its relationship with breast cancer, actually. So that's the way that she's been taking that research. And I won't speak for her research, but I think in that case, thinking of as a positive effect, that it might actually be associated with lower rates of breast cancer having denser mammary glands. And again, I can't speak on her work, but yeah, I mean, I think there's always this fluctuation. There's always a possibility that something could go horribly wrong, but you wouldn't see this signature of positive selection if it had been very deleterious in the end. So seeing that positive selection for the trait indicates that it must have been more advantageous than anything that was going along with it that's negative. But maybe time will tell, right? So sometimes it just takes a while for those things. I think it really highlights why we need so many different types of science and scientists, because we can pose these hypotheses about this, and the information about EDAR comes from work that was done on mice in a laboratory by people who work, in molecular biology, and so we need all these different types of science to really understand this complicated picture. And that's why we continue going back to why we build each other up, right? Can't do it alone. So you might as well help other people along the way. And then hopefully as a team, or all this overlapping and collaborative research, you can really start to peel back some of the layers and understand what's going on. And I mean, that's another great thing about science, is we're never going to solve it all. So there will be questions forever. It's just kind of exciting. Always more to do.
I'm curious where that question for you and your team came from, because when I heard you mention this, it's in some ways kind of like magic to me that you can be looking at teeth and learn something about vitamin D and mammary gland density. So what was the process of coming up with that story? I mean, who noticed that there could be a connection here? And was that built on previous work that had already connected the teeth to the EDAR gene, and then just connecting all those dots for what could be affected?
Yeah, so it's definitely a very complex process, and I'm going to give Dr. Lusko all the credit here, but definitely noticing, it starts a long time ago, noticing variation in dental shoveling in different human populations and seeing these patterns of variation. And then the molecular work showing that EDAR in particular affects dental shoveling in mice. And then from that, looking at how EDAR varies in human populations and seeing that that's correlated with the dental shoveling. So you're like, okay, well, that makes sense. It affects dental shoveling. We're seeing the same thing. And then asking why might there be, these variation in EDAR expression across human populations. And that's when you get into the brainstorming and really starting to think what could be the advantage, right, of EDAR that would be under selection, and that we can see it because of the teeth, but knowing that maybe there's something else that's advantageous. So that's when we started looking into the literature about what EDAR affects, and came up with this. I mean, Dr. Lesko really, she did all the legwork on that, but I did this really amazing story about mammary gland density and breast milk. And so again, that was the hypothesis that came out of that. And now she continues that work. So we generate these hypotheses and to ask new questions and really try and nail down the details of all that.
So it's really impressive example of, like you said, connecting the dots. Previous studies by people in different fields within biology and synthesizing from there with your unique contribution. So I'm really inspired by how she works in that way.
Oh, thank you. I do really appreciate interdisciplinary work and work that spans fields because, in my experience, nothing is ever one thing or another, right? It's usually meets halfway. So we're not going to solve all these questions by only being in paleontology or only being in molecular biology. So it's unfortunate in some ways that, universities are structured with these different departments and these different colleges, and the way grants are funded it's all very canalized and channeled. But I think that people are realizing we need to reach across those barriers and really try and be more interdisciplinary if we want to tackle the big questions.
Yeah.
Not that the small specific things aren't important, because that's how we got there, right? We needed that it's like a step in the ladder, and you need that to climb higher. But I do like that's where my focus is, on that broad interdisciplinary work. And for me, it's just so exciting intellectually and creatively, and just that's what I love to do. That's why I'm inspired by it.
Yeah, and so I guess we can transition then to what you started on, and I stopped you getting there, but about the relationship between teeth, prenatal growth rates, and reproduction. So maybe you can pick that back up.
Yeah, of course. So that's what I've been working on quite recently, and it, a lot of that interest came from the EDAR paper, which came out in 2018, and also work that I did with an undergraduate looking at marmosets and tamarins and why they don't have third molars. And so asking, again, a simple question about teeth, but then through the process of that research, realizing that it could very likely be related to their prenatal growth rates. They have very slow prenatal growth rates. And so that's when I first started thinking about how primates develop in utero and how that might affect dental variation. Because as I said, teeth start developing very early. And so for me, it's just always like it's so fun because it's just like one piece of the puzzle at a time, thinking about lactation and reproduction, thinking about prenatal growth rates and dental variation in marmosets and tamarins, and then thinking about how that might have played a role in human evolution itself. So we know that prenatal growth rates vary across primates. I was looking at anthropoid primates and, minus the tarsiers. I was looking at
That's common, isn't it? Minus the tarsier, because we don't know.
Yeah. I was looking at apes and monkeys and trying to understand how much variation there is in prenatal growth rate. Humans have the highest prenatal growth rates, much higher even than our closest living relatives. And trying to understand what role that might play in the distinct animal that we are today, in particular, the growth of our large brain, which starts very early on. To grow a brain as big as ours, especially relative to our body size, we have to start early in utero, putting a lot of energy into that development. And so that's what I was really thinking about and just asking, well, if teeth develop in utero, could they also hold signals of this prenatal growth rate like we hypothesized for marmosets and tamarins? And that's what we did. We looked at dental proportions, focused on the molars. And it's also very interesting because the reduction of the third molars in human evolution has been a long-standing question of interest. Why have our third molars been getting smaller and smaller? Is there an advantage to that? Is it related to changes in our facial structure or our brain size, all these things? And so I just wanted to know more about that. And we looked at dental proportions and found that they are highly significantly correlated with prenatal growth rate in primates. And we found that endocranial volume, so a way of measuring brain size, is also very significantly correlated with prenatal growth rates. And
can I ask you here, how are prenatal growth rates measured?
Yes, of course you can ask. Yeah, so it's literally measured as the mass of the neonate. So when the infant is born, how much does it weigh, divided by how long it was gestating. So it's neonatal mass divided by gestation length in days. So you could imagine it as, or you could describe it as how many grams of weight the fetus puts on each day that it's in utero. So if it puts on a lot more weight per day, it's got a higher prenatal growth rate. Humans grow very quickly in utero. But we do see all this variation, which means that it's something that evolution and natural selection can act on, right? And that's very important. Heritable, variable, very important for natural selection to act on. And so we also found that endocranial volume and molar proportions are also related. So everything's very significantly correlated quantitatively. And from that, we were able to build regression models to reconstruct prenatal growth from a fossil. So since we have this tight correlation in extant animals, you've got a certain molar proportion or a certain brain size, and that's associated with a certain prenatal growth rate. That means we can take a fossil, and if we have its molar proportions or we have its brain size, we can stick it into our regression, and it will output a reconstructed prenatal growth rate for that. So for the first time, we can take a fossil hominid and take its brain size or its teeth proportions and know something about how quickly it was growing in utero. And this is very important because, again, humans have a very fast prenatal growth rate. It's likely very strongly associated with some of the things that led to our evolutionary success, including our large brain. And it also says something about the maternal metabolism, physiology, because as that fetus is growing, it's relying on that gestating parent to give it all of its nutrients. So how many nutrients go through the placenta, how much, the mother, if you want to call it a mother in primates, it's how much they can contribute through their own metabolism and their physiology. And as that changes, that says something about how many resources it needed, both for the developing fetus and for that parent to be able to produce all that energy. And so it's just, again, it's very complicated, but that just means that with one small indicator, we can tell a lot about all the squishy things, all of those things that were happening that play such an important role in reproduction. And we certainly haven't figured it all out. This is just the beginning, but it's very exciting for me to think about the possibilities. Yeah, and especially to understand what hominids, what their reproduction might have been like, what their gestation might have been like in the past from some teeth. Yeah, the more lines of evidence we can get, the more we can learn from teeth, the better. And this is a super cool one for me. And just thinking about how pregnancy has changed since over hominid evolution, especially over the last 6 million years, which is what we looked at.
Mm-hmm. So one of the species groups that you looked at, calatrichids, I think, so the tamarins, marmosets, animals that typically twin, so they give birth to, smiling because we're eventually going to end up here. But So you mentioned that they are a group of species with slowed down prenatal growth rates, and you related that to twinning. So can you maybe explain a bit about that?
Yeah. So,
and how that fits in then with the teeth?
Yeah. So again, I still have a lot to pull apart here. This is all work in progress. So not even published or anything, but
we won't tell anyone.
Yeah. He whispers into the mic. Yeah. So, my thought and my understanding of this, callitrichids are very small. They're a very small primate. And it's hypothesized that they have a slow prenatal growth rate because they need to be small and they need to have small offspring. So you get that same constraint, like the head can only be so big when the animal's born. The neonate needs to have at least a certain amount of cognitive ability to be able to survive at all once it's born, right? So there's constraints on how small the neonate can be when it's born, but also how big it can be to still successfully be born without a lot of negative medical effects. So it's very likely that slow prenatal growth rate is what allows callitrichids to have very small babies. And they do have twins, and that's thought to be related to many things, including their social structure. It's, an advantage for their, it's a reproductive advantage. And I don't know as much about the ecology of having twins, but there's a lot of work that's been done suggesting that it's adaptive to have twins. It helps them, have more offspring that are able to survive. But body size is then crucial for that, because if you're going to grow two babies, then they obviously cannot be gigantic. They need to be even smaller to be able to fit in the uterus. And we see this with humans as well. So this is something I'm very interested in now for both personal and research reasons. But when humans have twins, they're very small as well. They're small in utero, they're small when they're born, and they're small when they grow up. And so we see these effects of body size that are associated with twinning. Now, what does it have to do with teeth? That's a more complicated question. With callitrichids, we hypothesize that slowing down their growth rate literally just slowed down the tooth development as well because of this complex web. And so perhaps the third molars never even develop because they never reach that point of development because of this slow growth rate. Since I mentioned in my talk, molar development is iterative. So the first molar develops first, and then it signals the second molar to develop, which signals the third molar to develop. So if you're slowing down your rate, maybe by the time you get to the second molar, you don't actually have enough time to signal for the third one to even start. So it just doesn't happen, and then it's not there. And so associated with that slow growth rate. But I think it's very interesting, and it has a lot of implications for human health, because slowing down growth of the fetus has a lot of negative health effects. It's the second leading cause of infant morbidity and mortality is fetal growth restriction, so slowing down growth in utero. So for me, I'm just very interested in trying to understand more about prenatal growth rates, how it's associated with body size, and how it might be associated with twinning or having multiples, and the health effects it has on humans, and what it says about teeth, but also the brain, because we know those things are connected as well. And it's possible that my next papers might not even have teeth in them at all. I don't know. So maybe I'm moving away from I'll never leave my love of teeth fully behind. But there's body size in general is just a very interesting phenomenon for me.
So one thing I've noticed over this week in just interactions with you and listening to you talk is that you don't hesitate to kind of put the personal with the professional, and that comes out in the outreach and SciComm stuff. But in this case, having twins obviously can't be something intentional that you fit into your professional life as well. So I'm kind of curious about maybe this has become more interesting to you because of your personal experience, but just that ability to relate like something so significant in your personal life to one of the major aspects of your current research. So the timeline on this, had you already started thinking about and studying callitrichids, for example, before your twins were born.
I did study callitrichids before I had twins. And I also studied body size. I've always been I mentioned just yesterday, the poodoo deer. It's the smallest deer in the world. I've just always been fascinated with insular nanism. So on islands, animals getting small, or the poodoo in very dense tropical forests getting very small. So changes in body size have been always very interesting to me. And then I studied callitrichids, thinking about prenatal growth, and they had twins. But no, sometimes, I'm a scientist, but things align. And so for me, my personal interest does drive it. And as you said, my personal experience. So being someone who gestated twins and just learning what that meant, the health implications, and it's quite dangerous. And then knowing that they would be small. So all of those things did play a role in thinking more about this, and sort of triggered some of my interest and some of the questions that I asked. And I also mentioned this, and I can't remember which talk it was, but this is why it's so important to have people with diverse experiences and diverse backgrounds, because they ask different questions because of their own life experience. And so that's just so crucial, because you can ask completely new questions if your own experience leads you to think of something. And so I think it's just very important to have many types of people in science asking many different kinds of questions, because we do combine the personal with the scientific, and we do draw on our own experiences for our interest and to ask questions. And so for me, knowing twins are small, and knowing that my twins are small, and knowing that it can have health impacts and all of these things, just got me thinking more about this and what's happening. And I do think that there is something very interesting going on with body size and human evolution and twinning. And I won't get into too much because I don't want to spoil it. Why? I got some very cool ideas though. So keep an eye out for.
Yeah, we'll do a round two
sometime
in the future. Well, Susumu, am I missing anything? Some burning question that you have about this topic while we're on teeth before we transition into the next?
I think we've covered it pretty well. But I just wanted to say that being able to learn something about prenatal growth from fossilized remains of teeth suddenly opens up the window into the past, because as Tesla mentioned, most of the fossil record is made up of teeth. So it is a huge discovery and something really exciting to me.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So, okay, so let's transition a little bit. Well, actually, I haven't yet asked you, we talked about the talks that you've given us. So that's the service that you've provided to us. But what service are we providing you here? So what are you trying to accomplish this week in the collection, and where do you think that will go?
Yeah, so there are wonderful primate collections, and I'm only looking at the primate collections, but I do, Susumu showed me the non-primate collections, and got a lot of animals that have very small body size in there. So I can certainly imagine coming back for other interesting research questions. But right now I'm looking at primates, and I'm measuring teeth. I'm measuring skulls. We have been developing a database of dental measurements for, almost a decade now that I've been a part of. And a lot of the primates that you have here in the collections are pretty hard to find in the United States. So I've spent a lot of time at the Smithsonian, for example, and you just can't always get very perfect sample sizes. So I'm really excited to add to our data for those dental measurements and those skeletal measurements. And it's going to go into so many projects. I can't even say them all, but more papers looking at dental proportions and how they're correlated with other parts of the skeleton. I'm particularly interested in how facial prognathism, so the length of the face, is associated with dental proportions. That goes back to thinking about humans, and that reduced M3 is the shortening of the face part of why we have a small third molar. Well, first question is, do we see variation in third molar length, relative third molar length, being associated with facial length? So that's a paper I'm working on right now. I'm interested in covariation, so how different parts of the cranium and the teeth covary, meaning as one gets larger, do the other parts automatically get larger as well? And I think this is also very important for paleontology because, a lot of what we do, we work with, it's a puzzle with only a few pieces, right? So we don't have all of the pieces of the puzzle. And so sometimes we definitely look at variation across a wide geographic area, across a lot of time. And sometimes we put more value on that variation than maybe is warranted by biology itself. So is an animal with a longer face a different species just because it has a longer face, or is it because it's just larger in general, and so the face goes along with that covary? Does it have a more robust supraorbital torus because it's a different species, or because it has a wider face in genetically and developmentally? That part of the face is all developing at the same time and with some of the same genes affecting it. So really trying to understand how variation is patterned and how different parts of the skeleton change in concert, in unison, and what that can tell us not just about how the skeleton develops and which genes might be connecting which parts of the body, which, as I mentioned, is very interesting to me. That's going back to that EDAR or prenatal growth, but also how we should interpret variation in the fossil record in terms of, is this actually significant and meaningful and indicative of different species, or is it just indicative of maybe changes in body size, which happen very quickly over short periods of time? And so when you're looking at two fossil sites that are 10,000, 20,000 years apart, in geologic time, that's not very much at all. So we definitely look at fossils across 10,000, 20,000 years, but maybe we need to adjust our assumptions about how much change you would expect, even just in body size in the same species, and then how that change would affect parts of the cranium or the teeth without necessarily resulting in an animal that it was unable to reproduce with its its cohort that was a little bit smaller, for example. Very complex questions, but I'm just very interested in the primate fossil record, and there's a lot of variation that we see, but how much variation, and is it more than we'd expect? I don't know.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. And I know Susumu also you've also been interested in body proportions and size. And
yes.
You've put up various works out as well with different groups of animals.
Yeah.
So how, based on what Tesla's been mentioning, do you see parallels then with some of the work you've been doing? Or do you think primates also fit some of the other patterns? I think we talked in a recent interview with you about lagomorphs, for example, why rabbits aren't so big.
Yes, body size is it is a major axis along which mammals have diversified. So it is super important for understanding why we have this enormous diversity of mammals today. Going back to this research on relative tooth sizes, I have an ongoing project that has a similar theme, but in my case, I'm working with a student here looking at limb bone proportions. So our arms and legs are made up of several bones, and their relative lengths can be a good indicator of where the animal spends most of its time, whether it's on open grassland or more closed environment. And so we are interested in figuring out variations in limb bone proportions within a species of carnivoran, raccoon dog, which is pretty common around here. And that's an ongoing project. Mm-hmm. But looking at proportions is another important way of getting to how animals evolve and adapt to their environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that also connects to the covariation, right? So proportions, that's essentially what it is. The relative lengths of things. And as one gets longer, does the other one get longer or not? And it's also really important because when you think about how selection can act on parts of the body, if things are tightly constrained, then it inherently has to act on the whole limb and not just one part of it.
Right.
So it's really, it says something about how much change you can expect and how much selection can change one part of the body versus, so the skull, for example, it's made up of many, many bones, but they're all very tightly, they evolve together to form this armor for our brain that does really important functions and it has all these important things going on and it contains all of our sensory organs, essentially, except for the touch. But so can evolution act on one part of the skull? How does it do that? And then how much can it change it without changing the other parts? So all of these things are connected in thinking about how natural selection can create the diversity of forms that we see. It really depends on how interrelated these different parts are and these different bones are. And are they constrained or are they able to evolve in these different directions? And so we're asking, it's just so many layers. We're asking questions about what animals do, how they move around, how many species there are, but also how does evolution work, right? Mm-hmm. How does it produce the variety of vertebrates that we see? What are the genes that play a role in that? How does development work? How much can selection pull certain parts of the body away from others? So it's just a lot of layers of questions that are really important in evolution.
That sounds super interesting and definitely looking forward to hearing more about it maybe the next time we have a chance to talk. As we kind of come, not exactly, but towards the close of this interview, I want to, you mentioned the Smithsonian. And I know maybe we're thinking about lunch a little bit here too, but you mentioned the Smithsonian and I can't let you go until we talk about science communication a little more. But there were two things on my mind about the Smithsonian. The first was recently we did an interview for the PrimateCast with Brianna Pobener at the Smithsonian's National Museum. And she was working in the Hall of Human Origins, and on their website, they have this survey that people can take. It's what makes us human. I think that's exactly the phrasing for it. But you also, a few years ago, put together this "What Does It Mean to Be Human" integrative symposium, and I think you were in Switzerland at the moment. But so that was the kind of first link with Smithsonian. The other one was you mentioned in your SciComm talk the other day that one of your major interactions with the Smithsonian was for this bearded ladies. So these are two things I want to get to. The first is about this symposium. I noticed on your website that you had been planning another one. Maybe COVID was kind of getting a bit in the way of that, but maybe you can talk about this. And specifically, I think you mentioned in your talk that one of your main goals was to invite a lot of early career scientists to talk about their own research and give them a stage, a platform, not only to share their own work, but also to be a part of that, emerging community and share ideas with each other. So can you talk about maybe the idea for the symposium, where you hope to take it in the future, and why it's so important to you that it really has a heavy early career scientist involvement?
Yes, absolutely. So the reason that it has not yet happened is I put it into every grant application that I write, funding for the next one. But I'm still working on that. So as soon as one of those grants comes through, I will have the funding. And obviously COVID did impact that. So I called it IHES, Integrative Human Evolution Symposium. And I ran the first one in 2019 in Zurich. And the graduate campus there funded that through a grant that I wrote with some graduate students there. And yeah, as you said, a big focus was on early career. In fact, I exclusively invited early career scientists, and it was pretty much the same idea as my graduates radio show, that yes, I want to talk about these really cool things and I want to talk about research, but graduate students and early career scientists need more opportunities to practice talking about their work, right? So this is building people up, right? Giving people the opportunity to present, to practice communicating their science to a diverse group of people across many fields, to put it on their CV, to help them advance their own career, right? We can learn a lot from senior scientists. They've done a lot of great work, but they don't need the practice, right? They don't need the practice. They don't need to put it on their CV. They don't need any of that. So because so much work is being done by early career scientists and graduate students, and it's very interesting work, it's very cutting edge, I thought, why not just invite them, give them a chance to talk about what they're doing and why it's important, and really also to emphasize having people from a lot of different fields and a lot of different personal life experiences and backgrounds, and just providing a platform for the things that I care about. Because that's really all we can do is, what do you care about? How do you advance that agenda? And so my agenda is diversity and inclusion in science, and promoting early career scientists, and helping people get jobs and get where they want to be in science. So all of those things were a focus. And it was super cool because I did bring together people from a lot of diverse fields, including paleogenomics and evolutionary anthropology, but also linguistics and psychology and other fields as well. And there were even people talking about AI and like recognition of patterns of like human movement and just all these really interesting things. And as I said earlier, I like big patterns. I like interdisciplinary work. I have some of my best ideas when I am thinking about projects that are outside of my area of expertise. And this does go back to Berkeley, because we were in integrative biology, which sometimes people at faculty at Berkeley joke is called leftover biology. So it's not environmental science, policy management. It's not molecular and cell. It's everything else. And so we just had so many people studying so many different things. And I would go to talks, and this was just such a wonderful time in my life. I would go to talks on the most random things ever. And that is where I would have some of my best ideas. So I wrote a paper about using machine learning to try and identify species in the fossil record. And I got that idea from a talk on bird calls that I went to. And, I don't know anything about birds. I like music. I like sounds. But it was just a really cool talk. And I just think, I like to draw inspiration from a wide variety of sources. And so I like to promote that. So that's what IHES was. I am definitely hoping to run more of it. Maybe it'll be every 5 years. Maybe it'll be every 10 years. But there will be another one. So don't worry about that. And I will do the same thing. I will bring together early career scientists and people from the humanities and social sciences as well. I'm really interested in, as I'm sitting in the anthropology department now, I'm really growing fond of bringing together people from arts and humanities with people from the sciences to try and complement each other and think about things in different ways and hear different ways of thinking about problems and solutions. So, that was IHES, and it was very fun.
It's really great. Susuma will know this too. Like one of our, a few years ago, this was before the pandemic, some graduate students in our group started this international, it was a student symposium on animal behavior and cognition. And they ran the first one, I think here in Kyoto, and got some pretty good reception. It was just, almost exclusively for students as well in those fields. And we just heard that there's another, I think even the third one now being held this year, or it was just held. And so some of the students who organized the initial one were talking about how pleased they were that, other students saw enough value in this that, groups from around the world, whoever kind of comes up with the money and the way to set it up can now do that, tap into the original organizing structure. And so it seems to be, moving around, and maybe the funding is different each time, but something that's kind of stayed and persisted. And I think everyone, because they see so much value in getting together as graduate students and doing that. So it's pretty neat. I remember when I was a grad student in Calgary, we had like regional ones. So that there were some like small scale regional groups that would sometimes get together, whether it's annual or biannual or something. But it's really neat to see it on a global scale as well. So
yeah, and I'll share an idea. It's okay if people steal this idea because it's a great idea. Maybe someone wants to fund it though. But one idea I have I think would be so fun. I'm really interested in music. You've seen that from my talk. I think it would be so fun to work with local musicians and local bands and have them write songs inspired by different scientific themes, and then basically have a performance where you have a scientist come to talk about that scientific theme, maybe just like a 5-minute lecture, and then you have a band perform a song based on that idea. And so really just combining this, art and science. And I think you can bring new people into science that way, and different types of people. And we're talking about science communication. If getting the message out is the most important thing, which it is, then lots of people want to come to a rock concert and maybe learn about science on the way. That'd be so fun. So if anyone wants to fund that, just let me know. I'll make it happen.
Yeah, why haven't you, I'll ask it then directly, why haven't you done that? Or have you done something like that? Because you obviously have the music bug, and you have the people, you have a band that you perform with.
It's just something about, getting hired in 2019, 6 months before a global pandemic and 7 months before I had my twins. I've slowed down a little bit. So I have lots of ideas, and they'll pick up speed moving forward. But
do you know it's a long way from Amphioxus? It's a song that was written by a marine biologist.
Right.
That's about vertebrate evolution. So my advisor used to sing it in his class to undergrads, and you should look it up. It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can imagine like the potential for cringeworthiness. It sounds high.
Well,
no offense to your former advisor.
we sang it together in that class.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to ask the next as soon as we're off the air, Susumu.
Yeah.
I'm going to hear it.
But if I may ask related question about organizing a symposium.
Yeah.
So in terms of promoting diversity and inclusion in science, well, you said you focused on inviting early career scientists, but what are other considerations that organizers can make to that end?
Yeah, so early career, definitely choosing people from different fields, so interdisciplinary in that way. I did my best to have gender balanced representation, for example. And I was in Zurich, so a very international university. So I did choose speakers who had different international backgrounds as well.
Yeah.
So you can be selective in who you invite, and just make sure that you get a wide range of people. And I also think it's good for a lot of reasons, but if you want to reach an audience, SciComm's all about reaching audiences and spreading the message. Different voices are going to reach different people. And so if you want to maximize your audience, then having different types of speakers is the best way to maximize who you reach, I think. Yeah.
So on that very related note in equity and diversity and inclusivity, one of the other outreach programs that you were part of, this Bearded Ladies, and I think that's wonderful. So you just mentioned about, maybe involving musicians in order to kind of get messages out to different audiences. But in this one, literally, the Bearded Lady Project is in your face. It's also on your face.
Yes.
So maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I can't take any credit. I just participated. It was such a cool project. And the goal was to raise awareness about gender disparity in paleontology, and that, paleontology, like a lot of sciences, still it does not have good equity and does not have equal representation of genders or people from diverse backgrounds. And so they were specifically focused on women in paleontology and just raising awareness that there are lots of women paleontologists, and that you don't have to have a beard to be a scruffy paleontologist out in the field. And so that's where the beard came in. And we all posed with beards for portraits, and they interviewed people in films, and they talked about this nationally. It went on a national tour for years. It was really fun to be part of, and to just meet all the other women who are doing paleontology. And it's a great community, and it's super fun. And I've seen other versions too. So different projects for like being pregnant in the field, for example. So just showing, that's why I started my SciComm talk with what does a scientist look like? Because there are just so many scientists, and we all look different, and we all have different experiences. And I think the public doesn't know that yet. You know, they still think that a scientist looks a certain way, and that goes into so many different things. It goes into the kind of funding that's available, and which kinds of science get promoted, and who you believe when someone tells you something, right, about science, and the kind of careers that people aspire to have later in life. Kids, when they imagine what they can do and what they want to do. Representation is very important for demonstrating that, like, you can be anything you want. That's the goal, is that anyone can be anything they want. And so we need to give them, reinforcement by showing that we're out there, and, and also offering ourselves as someone to come talk to, or to ask questions about if you want to know more about it, or how we succeeded in this field, or why we do what we do. And there's a long way to go, as always, but every step forward is a good one, I think.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just to close out, and again, very much on the same line of thinking, you have more locally been invested in uncovering some of the stories of women in Washington. So you have this Washington Women. Maybe we can end by you're introducing that and why it's so important that you just mentioned showing people that they have opportunities with the Bearded Lady Project, but also having models is really important. And maybe that's one of the keys behind this Washington Women as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons I do it. So it's on Twitter, but I broadcast on the radio as well. And quite selfishly, I just wanted to know more of my local history. I'm from Washington, and I just want to know more about it. So it's a reason, an excuse to learn more about where I'm from and the people who've been influential in Washington. So it's mostly focused since Washington was made a state. So it's more recent in that way, and it's focused on women, and we could expand it in many ways. But another really important part of it is that these stories are being lost, right? So we have all this stuff on the internet. There's just so much stuff on the internet. Sometimes it feels overwhelming to find things. And the stories of these women will be lost if we don't continue to present them to people and to tell people about them and their accomplishments. And I see this already, because when I look for women from certain backgrounds that I know have lived in Washington, I know that they're really important and influential Mexican communities in Washington, and yet I cannot find any history about these women. I know women did important things, but no one has written about it. And so, I'm doing what I can to make sure and bring it to the surface as much as I can. But this is also, again, why it's so important to have diverse perspectives in academia, because people have vested interest in things that they relate to and things that they like. And if we have more people who are interested in the history of Mexican women in Washington, then we will see more written about it, and then these stories will not disappear. I wish we could all do our part, right? Choose something that you love, something that you're interested in, and just try and bring awareness to it in even a small way. It does make a big impact, I think. And I've learned about so many awesome women. It's really inspiring. And then you think about, man, just a stereotypical example of Faye Fuller, who climbed Mount Rainier in 1890 in a full skirt. And just thinking about climbing a mountain in the 1800s in full skirt and garb. I just can't even imagine. It was just the things they accomplished, and it was so much harder back then. And it's inspiring. It's like, okay, well then I should probably go do some climbing because I've got all the gear and I can wear pants. So like, what's my excuse, right? So yeah, it's really inspiring.
You gave one other example during your presentation the other day too about Hatsuya Kurose, I think it was, this Japanese who during the wartime was interred. But there was a really heartwarming story as well about a university, I think, looking for, maybe you can mention that, looking to, because they wanted to award an honorary degree. Yeah,
so it's still all in progress, and it does, it makes me, sometimes I wonder why I do this, because, we're so busy, right? And then this kind of story is why I do it. So she was a student at the University of Puget Sound in Washington, and when she was interred, she was forcibly removed from the university along with many other Japanese American students. And so the university, has been over the last few decades trying to find these students and their families to give them degrees for the degrees that they could never complete because they were interred. And when I was looking into her, it was just by accident. I saw a photo of these Japanese American students in a music class through one of the library archives in the area, and I was like, "Ooh, like there's a name. Oh, okay, it's a woman from the past. There's a name associated with. Let me focus on see if I can find things about these women." And as I did the research, I found that the university was still has many students that they were never able to track down. But things have changed with the internet, the way we digitize text, and so I was able to find information about how she changed her name when she married actually someone who worked at Berkeley, who was a well-known scientist at Berkeley. I can't remember his name because I focus less on the men and more on the women. But she changed her name and she moved, and I was able to track her down and her family down and give that information to the university, and they were very grateful. It's still all in progress, but it sounds like they're going to try and reach out and. Yeah, talk about making an impact. I mentioned a couple times that, we want to think that our science is important, and we are doing really important things in science, and it's just a really big questions to ask. But sometimes having an impact on one person's life just feels so much more meaningful, and it just, it really makes me feel good about how I spend my time and what I'm doing, and we all want to feel good. So. Yeah, that one made me feel good, and I hope she does get her honorary degree and her family gets it, and that's why I do Washington Women. Yeah,
that's a wonderful story, and maybe to just tie this back to something we talked, it seems like many eons ago at the beginning of this interview about imposter syndrome. So you obviously can take a lot of pride in these kinds of activities that you're pushing, and they're obviously important to you, and I think it's an excellent model for others. Not just in science, but for anybody to find ways to contribute, and they can be small if you just influence a single person. This podcast, I can't claim to have thousands and thousands of listeners for every episode, but I feel like, if we can reach even a small people of dedicated and really interested listeners, that has a lot of value to me and to them, even if it's just a single person. But I feel like we can relate that in many ways to helping us overcome that sense of feeling like an imposter as well. When we, as scientists, think about outreach and science communication and reaching diverse audiences, that imposter can rear its ugly head as well and say, but you have no special expertise on that thing. So who do you think you are that you can go and there is a non-trivial aspect to that, because scientists kind of swerving out of their lanes can have a tendency to cause harm. We talk about Nobel laureates who get into, certain discriminatory ways of thinking, and that can be damaging. But maybe more simply, like how, for you, this is something that's important to you, but how do you kind of get over that? Like, I don't have any specific expertise or background in these topics. So how do you motivate yourself then to keep doing it? Or to even get started? And that can serve as advice for anyone out there who wants to do more outreach and communication, but just feels like maybe what they focus on is way too esoteric to have an impact.
Yeah, and that's a big question. Just from my own personal life, I want to be happy. Okay, that's the goal for me. I think that's a good goal for people to have, is to be happy. And I want to do things that I love. And I love science, and I love making an impact, and I love these issues that I care about, trying to make the world a better place. And I don't know, just one day at a time, I guess. I had this poster when I was growing up that it's so silly, but it really made an impact on me. And it was just this silly story about this person walking along the beach, and there were just all these starfish stranded on the sand. Have you heard this story? I don't know, it's kind of silly, but just walking along, just thousands of starfish stranded on the sand, and just picking them up one by one and throwing them back into the ocean. And someone said, "Why are you doing that? There's too many. You can't make a difference." And he said, "It made a difference to that one." And so for me, that's really stuck with me. I think it's, we live in this world where it's just so overwhelming. Everyone's overwhelmed. Everything is so hard and so overwhelming. And all we can do is just take one step at a time and make a difference, one person at a time. And I don't know if I'm always doing the right thing or the best thing, but, I trust myself. I like myself. I'm happy with myself. And so I do what I think is right. And hopefully it does make a difference for people.
Well, Dr. Tesla Monson, Dr. Susumu Tomiya, thank you so much for joining me on the PrimateCast.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to the PrimateCast. The podcast is hosted and produced by me, Dr. Andrew McIntosh, Senior Scientist for Wildlife Conservation at the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo, formerly Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at Kyoto University. Join me for new episodes as often as I can get them out on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Leave a rating or a review of the show to help other listeners find it. Connect with me through our website, theprimatecast.info, or social media on X, Facebook, or Instagram. Feel free to comment, ask questions, suggest future guests, or share whatever else might be on your mind. If you value the show, consider donating or becoming a member. You can do so by visiting theprimatecast.info and clicking on the big yellow Buy Me a Mic button, which takes you to our campaign page. Or you could click on that little heart icon next to the social media links in your podcast player, or on the text link in the show notes. Your support will help cover production costs and is essential to ensure that I can continue to produce quality informational and inspirational interviews with leading figures in the field long into the future.